you ever wondered where the energy comes from that allows spirit to descend into form, that allows us to be created, that allows us to live our lives, and for this whole environment to be animated? Well, that's what we're going to talk about today. And, if we look at where energy comes from in all of our technology and everything that we've developed, basically it comes from a battery. And what is a battery but a plus and a negative? So today I want to talk about what that positive and negative looks like in our world and how that energy works in terms of what we're calling the two-world split or the event. A lot of people are kind of talking about this splitting that they're seeing, and I wanted to also liken it to cellular meiosis, which is the process within human cells that creates sperm and ova cells. So I believe that there's actually a parallel between these, and I really like using analogies because I think according to the Law of Correspondence, if we use something that we know, we can actually understand things that we don't know, because really everything's a fractal and uses a very similar process. So let's look at this battery. Basically, if we say that we need a positive and negative to create this energy that creates our life force, then what that means is that for life to exist as we know it in form, we need good and bad, good and evil. We need those polarities, and it's a really interesting way to look at it, to think that there would be no life force if there was no evil. So I guess that gives us a little bit of a different perspective on some of the bad things that are happening at the moment around the world. We tend to judge these bad things that are happening and saying they're bad, but interestingly, if you look at all the prophecies, whether it's the Bible or the Mayans, everybody, all the religions have seen these end times, and they've seen an escalation of all of the negative polarities at this time. And I think in Hindu philosophy, they call this the end of Kali Yuga, as an epoch or a period where we're moving into Satya Yuga, which is actually a time of what might be called heaven on earth. So we might think that what we're going through now is bad, but actually it's in perfect and divine order based on the cycles that have been prophesized and based on the cycles that have been playing out throughout all of history of the universe. Okay, so let's start having a look at the battery and what it is in, I guess, our human reality. So I'm just going to rub this off. I actually did a video a little while ago, and I'm going to put a link to it, but it was really explaining the move from 3D to 5D and how duality was different between those two dimensions. So I'll just cover that really briefly now. But basically, if we look at how our world is now, there is really an inside and an outside. The inside being what goes on inside of us, and there being the form outside. So we may say that, there's an inside and that's us, and then around us is form. So basically, for this battery to work, there has to be a plus and a negative. And what we've tended to do in 3D is have one of the poles inside us and the opposite pole outside us. So as an example, we may have a negative inside of us, such as I am inadequate, and then in the outside we'll project that somebody else is adequate. And we can have the reverse situation happen, where we may say outside is a bad person, a perpetrator, and that makes us a good person because we're not a perpetrator. So you can see how these projections create our battery so that we have this duality inside and outside of us. I think the really important thing too here is to understand that we have a lot of pluses inside of us and a lot of negatives outside of us, most of us. So what this means is that we see a lot of bad things outside of us. We criticize a lot of things. We judge a lot of things. We see a lot of things as being wrong. So this 3D part of our cycle is really based on judgment. So now what I want to do is liken this to a human cell that's about to undergo meiosis, undergo its own split. So in a cell, in a human cell, there are 46 chromosomes. So I'm not going to draw 46 chromosomes, but I'm going to use a couple of different colours here. So we have one chromosome pair. One comes from our father and one comes from our mother. So they're actually the same chromosome, you know, chromosome number 1 or chromosome number 2, but we have one from our mother and one from our father. So there's 2 chromosome 1s, 2 chromosome 2s, and 2 chromosome 3s as an example. But of course, there are 46 chromosomes. So we can already start to see a similarity here in that our cells are balanced too, with a positive and a negative. So within the cell there is also duality to explain where this life force comes from with the interplay of opposites. Now what happens when the cell is about to split in a human is that all of the chromosomes get pulled into the center. So it kind of looks like this. We have a cell, and then all of the matching pairs of chromosomes get pulled into the center of the cell, just like this, ready to split. Now, at this point in the cell process, there's a lot of interchange of DNA that goes on between the chromosomes to create new DNA. But basically, this is how it is in terms of preparation of the split. So if you saw my earlier video, you'll see that in the human 5D, I talk about bringing back all of the archetypes and aspects that have been projected outside of us, back inside of us, into the center, because in the human world, we are the center. So let's make this a bit bigger. So basically what we're saying here is that all of these things that were inside us, outside of us, we now have to own. So all of these negatives and positives that we projected outside of us, we have to pull back into the center. It doesn't mean we have to be these negatives. It just means that we have to accept that this is part of life's process, and that by owning them, it allows us in the future, if we wish, to choose them. Just like the human cell that has pulled all of its chromosomes into the center, ready to split, as does the human pull all the archetypes and aspects back into the center, ready to split. So what happens next when the human cell is about to split, when it's undergoing meiosis, is it creates these things called spindles. And what the spindles do is that from each pole of the cell, they attach to one of the chromosomes of the pair, and they then pull the chromosomes into one of the sides of the cell, kind of like this. One over here, one over here. So basically what you end up with is a half a cell with a half a complement of the chromosome, so therefore half a complement of the DNA, and then when the cell is ready to split, what happens is it splits. And so really you end up with 2 cells. I haven't drawn that very well, but you can get the picture. There are now 2 cells, each with half of the complement of DNA. Let's relate this back to the 2-world split now, and theoretically what might happen based on what we see happening in cellular meiosis. So if we take the same example, I don't know what spindles might look like, but for a positive and negative to be drawn apart, you obviously need a positive and a negative. So let's say that a negative develops on this side and a positive develops on this side. Well, what will happen is that all the negatives will get pulled to the positive pole, and all of the positives will get pulled to the negative pole, in the same way that I guess spindles work. So what we can kind of see happening here is that we have the universe, and we have all the positives pulled up one end and all the negatives pulled down another end. So what I think is really interesting about this is, I don't know whether this pulling of frequencies is a physical thing or an energetic thing, or it's probably both, of course. But the thing that springs to mind is like those visions of rapture. And you know, where people are being pulled up into the air, up into the sky, the chosen ones, the harvest, whatever it is that we might think about when we think of rapture. But I find it really interesting that there's such a strong correlation here between positives being pulled in one direction, harvest, and the negatives going the other way. So then if we think about that, and then what happens with meiosis is the cell splits, well then, you know, the world splits, doesn't it? So now we end up with, I'll draw this a bit better, now we end up with, you know, two different worlds here, one with all the positives and one with all the negatives. And I think we can look at this in terms of what people are calling the split between the world of service to others, which we might see as the positive, where you know, everything is about serving the whole. And we might look at the negative world here as being service to self, which is where the whole idea is that, you know, you're the only one here, so it doesn't really matter what you do outside of you, as long as you're okay, all the negative aspects and archetypes can play out. So notice here that in terms of our battery, is that what we have now is the battery is still balanced, but instead of being balanced within one world, it's actually balanced between two worlds. So we're still getting the creation of life force, it's just a different way that the battery now works. So coming back to talking about Kali Yuga and Satya Yuga, Kali Yuga is the time where there is the most negative in the world, and I'm going to put up a bit of a quote about this. I think they say that 3/4 of archetypes are negative and 1/4 are positive, but when we move into Satya Yuga, they basically say that all is good. There's 100% positivity. So in a way, that's what we see now with this split and this particular world full of good. And I also think that it's interesting to relate this back to the story of Adam and Eve in the Bible, where, you know, Eve ate of the tree of knowledge of good and evil, suggesting that before we ate of the tree, everything was good. And that in that period, that would be Satya Yuga, where all was good. And then the part of the cycle where we've eaten of the tree of good and evil means that now the negatives are back into the world, and that's where we start to move through the cycle again. So it's interesting now to look at what the next step of the cycle will be after Satya Yuga. Obviously that's probably a long time in the future, but if we look at the human cell, what's the next thing that happens with, let's take an ovum? Fertilization. So in comes the sperm, brings in a whole new set of chromosomes ready to match up with these chromosomes here. So after fertilization, we go back to having a full complementary set, one from the mother and one from the father. And so that is the next cycle of life. That is the next grand experiment in form, by bringing together completely new chromosomes and new DNA. So I suspect when we look at the two-world split, you know, we're about to go through this split, however that looks like. I think it's going to be a big surprise, whatever it is. But then what happens is, then our world will at some point be fertilized again with new material, new ideas, new concepts, new archetypes, to then play out this whole cycle again. I think this is a really good analogy to use to explain what's going on from just a completely different perspective. For me personally, for many years now, I have been seeing the world splitting like a cell like this. I have a background in molecular biology and genetics, so I guess that's a natural thing for me to make a comparison here. But I don't know, when you put it together like this, it just seems to make so much sense, and I think it can give us a really good perspective on what might be about to happen. So I hope that this gives you some different ideas about how to look at our upcoming two-world split, and I'll talk to you soon.